Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Dupas, Chief Operating Officer at Tabs Analytics. Welcome to our webinar on New Business Metrics with the Same Old Market Data, Part 3. In this session, we'll revisit previous topics of how to better analyze the data in our industry, and also we'll dive into a few new metrics like leakage versus slippage, power index, and innovation analysis. I also want to make everyone aware of a few of our upcoming webinars that will take place over the next few months. Our food and beverage study will take place on September the 14th. On October the 12th, we'll discuss best practices of fact-based selling. And finally, in mid-November, we'll present the third annual cosmetic and skincare study. Be sure and check back at our website at tabsanalytics.com for webinar invite as well as the exact times. Presenting today is Dr. Kurt Jetta, CEO and founder of Tabs Analytics. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions that you can submit via the chat box on your GoToWebinar screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jetta.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you for all of you attending today. Happy to announce that we have a record sign-up for this webinar, and I see there's already 91 attendees, which is a very good turnout, and I appreciate all of you making the time. Just a couple things about the webinars. We're going to go back to a monthly regular schedule on the webinars. In the last year or so, it's been somewhat sporadic. It'll always be in the middle of the month, always be on a Wednesday, except under really special circumstances. Also, there's a benefit for those of you that might be listening to this only as a recording. There's a benefit to attending live. First of all, you'll get all the Q&A, which the recording will stop recording after I do the presentation, as well as you'll be receiving follow-up content relating to the topics we'll cover today. So if you have been on any other webinars, you may have seen that we have all our webinars recorded and posted. And so we've done a part 1 and part 2 of new business metrics with the same old market data. So the premise being that if you were in category management right around the early 90s when scanner data became widely available to the industry, somebody put you in a cryogenically frozen seal, you were just thawed out today, you could pretty much pick up exactly where you left off back 24, 25 years ago. The techniques of the analysis really haven't changed all that much. And so what we've been trying to do at Tabs Analytics is really show you that there are different ways, different technologies, not software, but analytical technologies that we can bring to bear to give you a competitive advantage and really make you more efficient and effective with your data. The 3 topics we'll be covering today. First of all, we'll talk about sales productivity, which many of you may have been already aware of, but then we're going to add an element to that called the power index. We'll do some updated innovation analysis, and then we'll introduce conversion analysis and specifically focus on the concepts of leakage, which many, if not most of you are aware of, but then slippage, which I'm sure very few are aware of or have heard of. So we'll talk about what those differences are and how to capitalize on that when you do your jobs. So let's go back to that. I mean, this is, when I talk about nothing's really changed in the industry, I mean, it's still the vast majority of the analysis is talking about dollars and dollar share and dollar sales change, maybe some units, but it's still very linear, still very basic. And usually from a category management standpoint, that's how traditional space to sales analysis conducted using dollar sales and dollar share. But if I look at unit share, and here's an example we're taking in hair care. So we've divided hair care in what we call merch seg. So we align the category definition on the way it is merchandised in the store, not so much the way a marketer might look at it, knowing that hair care actually can show up in many areas of the store, in men's grooming and ethnic hair care. So this is just general hair care right here. And specifically when I isolate on units, so you see that mid-range hair care generates about 2 times more sales than salon based on that share. But if I look at the disparity in units, it's a 7-to-1. relationship. And I would argue that units is actually more relevant when we're doing space to sales analysis, because we're trying to set the planogram and we're trying to align it with the way consumer demands the product. And also, to the extent that in-stocks are important, you want to make sure that there's sufficient amount of product. So for example, mid-range, 54% of the units are going out as mid-range. Now we're going to introduce another concept called ACV weighted skews, and that's going to be our proxy for share of shelf. So to the extent that you don't have access to planograms, or you don't have the resources to go conduct field audits where you would have to do multiple different sets, we're going to use this measure as a proxy for how much of the shelf each segment or each brand takes of the total. So we're back to our sales and our shares of dollar and units, but now we're adding a share of SKUs. And to get to that, we do that ACV weighted skew measure there. So you can see how mid-range has 384. And the way we get that number is it's basically adding up all the distribution points for all the items in that segment, dividing by 100. Many of you may know the term TDPs, or total distribution points. That's the same concept, except what we're doing is dividing by 100 to give you a more intuitive measure. If I told you I have 38,355 TDPs, what do I do with that? I mean, where's the intuition in that number? But if I told you you have 384 SKUs, what that's telling me is that I would expect to find about 384 SKUs from that segment in a typical store. Also, just as an aside, Jetta's first law of analytical presentation: if you want to shut down a room and cut off any questions, throw in plenty of Greek symbols and subscripts. That'll always shut down dissension or questions or challenges. Nobody really knows what to do with that, but in this case, this is a sigma, which is a summation of all the ACVs for all the various items, summing from the first one all the way to the total in the overall set. So now we take the comparison of dollars and units relative to the Skew Count, and we're going to call that sales productivity. And it's a productivity index we're creating, and I know this isn't quite an index, it's a percentage. Indexes are integers, but there's just a quirk with Excel and pivot tables that makes it a little bit difficult to get to that round number, but relatively speaking, it's the same. And so what this tells me is that the ratio of dollars per SKU at $207,000, the average item generates 9% more dollars, and on a unit basis, it's 35% more units. That gives me the relative sales of the overall average, and it really depends on, it's not necessarily to the category, it's whatever you determine the total to be. I could filter this based on this particular brand or a particular segment or a channel, whatever I'm looking at. If I take the inverse, or 1 minus that index, that's telling me in particular how far below I am. So salon, which is high, very premium brands, you can see that the dollar productivity really is right at the category average, but the unit productivity is quite low at 36%, which means it's 64% below the average. So you can see all the other segments are delivering units pretty well above the average or not all that below, but it's really this outlier in salon that's kind of really showing slow velocity. So I have two concepts here. I have dollar productivity and I have unit productivity. And how do I kind of marry those two, or do I marry those two? I mean, because they do have different importance. Perhaps some of you have heard me say that dollars per SKU or dollar productivity is a decent proxy for dollars per square foot, which is a measure of scarce cash, or I'm sorry, scarce space. And then unit productivity is a proxy for GMROI, which is a proxy for scarce cash. So they're really measuring two different and important resources from a retailer perspective, but both of those can be combined to give us a more efficient view of performance for various brands and segments. So for example, you see mid-range, it's above average in dollars and very strong in units, and if I multiply those two measures together, dollar productivity times units, I get a power index of 148. Salon, by contrast, is 101 times 0.36, so I'm at 36%. So even if I doubled the unit productivity of Salon, I'm still well below the average. So that's basically showing me I have to triple my units just to get to the category average. So it's a way to kind of accentuate both the strengths and weaknesses of this. So for example, premium hair care. It's below average on both. So the fact that it's not doing either one of those well is kind of hurts it, and that power index 0.88 times 0.82 gets me to a 72%. It gives me a much more efficient way to view that performance. I don't need to bring in two measures now. I can do it just with one. Let me give you an example. So I have dollar productivity at 200 and a unit productivity at 50. If I multiply those two together, I get 100. So if I doubled my unit productivity, that would get me to a 100 index. If I cut my dollar productivity in half, that gets me to a 100 index. Now I'm going to take another example where my dollar productivity is still at 200, but my unit productivity is at 30. Now I've seen some people in different industries. In fact, there are different categories and companies, and I actually know of one major retailer that will take the average dollars per store per week and average it with the units per store per week and then rank that. And here's an example of why that won't work. So the average on this one is 115. If I take this kind of concept, I'm going to cut this in half, dollar productivity, double the unit productivity to 60, I should come out with the same answer because I've essentially one offsets the other. But by taking the average, I've come up with 80, so this is showing below average performance. The right way to do it is multiply both, and the power index on both is a 60%. So you can see that the unit productivity is so low that it's not enough to offset the strength in the dollars, or really better said is the dollar productivity isn't strong enough to bring up the weakness in unit productivity. So I'm going to take an example of a power index in action, how we would actually use that. And to do that, I'm going to call up Tab's Total Insights. So this is a Tableau-based web-enabled tool that we use to do all kinds of analytics. So we're bringing in multiple data sources that I'll show you throughout the presentation: panel, scan, shipment, and bringing it all into one portal so I don't have to get in and get out. And we've created built-in then some of our more proprietary or unique analytics into it. What we're looking at here is we're comparing Mars, which is one, the retailer, to Earth, which is another. So it's a competitive analysis of retailers by everyday price point. The line is what percent of my section is accounted for at various price points. So you can see that Mars has much higher representation based on the line of higher end salon and premium type items. In fact, 25% of their assortment. But if I look at the bar, that's the power index. So I only need that one measure to show how relatively powerful. And you can see that relative weakness here, that all of them are well below. You see the same thing in Earth where we have the weakness, but they're not tying up near as much real estate. You can see by the percent of SKUs, it's well under half. If I look at where the majority of Skew Count is, it's in this $4 to $5 price range, and these power indices tell me that I'm roughly in equilibrium. I probably don't have a whole lot more upside by adding assortment here. But if I look down at this lower end here, I can see very powerful performance, these very strong power index for both retailers at this lower price point. And you can see their competitor has a not much more, but significantly more assortment than Mars. We can then further take a look at what are those items, and that gives me then I can tie in all this data through all the way up to the $2 price point to see what are the items that I'm not stocking that the competitor is. So this obviously can't be directly shared with your retail customers. You can't share the competitive data, but you can certainly, for your own internal analysis, identify where your voids are and then directionally identify and kind of qualitatively say, hey, we know that your key competitors are carrying these high-performing items that you should be looking at. And we can also show that your higher-end items tend to be a bit overextended based on that power index we're looking at. So that's where we can use a power index, but there's just dozens and dozens of applications for that measure. Now we're going to go into innovation analysis. And so first of all, the thing we want to do is identify what we're talking about. So we have to identify all the items and code them. So we're going to roughly talk about new as being it's in distribution for less than a year. There's existing distribution that has significant distribution for at least 1 year. And then here's a new concept many of you haven't seen, and I know there's a lot of clients on the line that we have not built this into our deliverable yet, but it's certainly something we will be doing in the very near future. Discontinued, the eliminated, it's an item that's eliminated or in the process of being eliminated. And really to do an optimal level of job in assortment, you have to be able to flag those discontinued items, and also just there's a lot of sales decomposition analysis that can be had by just understanding what type of assortment decisions and what type of innovation decisions have been made. Often I see a lot of times where clients will go in and they'll present, hey, you look at all these weak items, we can do better than. The retailer will say, well, I already discontinued them, so you didn't do your homework. So what we need then is a way to be able to efficiently flag all those items. And it's not as easy as you think. I mean, obviously, if something is 0 last year and 80 this year, that's a new item. But here's a sense for, is this an item that's being discontinued, or is it just reduced in store count? So last year for the quarter we had 88, it dipped to this quarter at 82, but if we look at the prior month at 68 and the current month is at 45, so is that new, or is that discontinued, or did it just be reduced in some of its assortment? We also have another scenario where we have 9% ACV last year. This year we jumped up to 60%, but in the more recent months it's only at 40 and then 30. So is that truly a new item, or was it an in and out item, and is oftentimes, particularly for slower moving items, this 30 is really a function of the fact that it didn't sell. The velocity wasn't high, and there were quite a few stores in a given month that just didn't sell even one piece. So how do we solve for that? Because anybody, I think, could get 80% of the cases right just based on their own knowledge and expertise. But to get those remaining 20% that's going to make or break your analysis, the way we solve for that is a machine learning algorithm that flags 1,000 different items. So you basically, the concept being, you're going to go in and tell the program, here's the right answer for these first 300 or so observations, and then it's going to take the pattern of choices you made to classify those items and then fill those in for the remaining observations. You're going to kind of repeat that function until you get a level of accuracy that you find acceptable. Now it may sound, ooh, machine learning, ooh, scary, wave fingers, be intimidated. I mean, there are certainly very advanced applications for machine learning, but there's actually some fairly cost-effective and straightforward applications out there and programs out there that you can use to classify data. And it really would behoove you, if you're serious about stepping up your analytics, to start learning about machine learning. I think a lot of the discussion about it kind of you see in the blogs and, more kind of it's getting ahead of itself a bit in our industry, but there certainly are appropriate applications for this type of capability. So just kind of keep that in mind, as you go forward. So with that ability now to identify discontinued items, let's take a look at an innovation analysis. So we're looking at the classifications existing, new, and discontinued, latest 12 weeks, and we try and isolate our innovation analysis on 12 weeks. What happens when we extend beyond that is a lot of the new items won't have the full, let's say, 24, 26 weeks. They won't even be in distribution. So it tends to dilute the performance and productivity reads that we get on new items, and unfairly so. So 12 weeks is really a good measure to make sure that most of the items will be in full distribution for those 12 weeks. So they could have gone in 39 weeks ago and still be new. So here's the Skew Count here, that ACV weighted skew, the average price, and the velocity. Units per skew is that velocity measure, and then all the percent change. So the first thing we want to look at, because by adding discontinued, it kind of adds all these new dimensions to the way we can review our assortment decisions. So first of all, the existing Skew Count looks like at this particular retailer we pared it back a little bit from 681 last year to 653 this year. Then we take a look at how many items we got rid of and how many were replaced in. So we see there's a net gain there from 266 up to 302. Then we go to the velocity. So we've looked at the quantity. Now we want to look at the quality of sales. So we're looking at existing velocity, and so we pared back our distribution, but the velocity didn't improve really at all. I mean, it's remarkably similar year over year on the existing item, which actually bodes well for that's a highly valuable number to predict the future of this category, is when your existing items, the velocity is pretty stable. The discontinued versus new, so we made some good decisions. We upgraded the performance here from 22,000 units per SKU up to 27, so that was an advancement. But also how the new items do versus what was there already. And almost always it's the case that they still don't do quite as well as the existing. But to the extent that we move the needle forward, that's a good thing. And you can see the overall positive benefit to the overall planogram. What we don't want to have happen, though, is add so many new items that are underperforming what was there that we kind of dilute the overall productivity of the whole section. What we see here, this units per SKU velocity, that did not happen. The velocity overall actually improved a bit because we made this improvement in the assortment decisions. So with that, let me turn now to another one of our software tools called Quick Tabs. And this then brings in the existing, new, and discontinued. This is that growth analysis that I showed you. Let's take a look at productivity, because that also then kind of gives us a better view of how new really does versus existing. And this is almost always the case. In HBC, there's usually, and that's a very typical gap, about 20% on both measures, and then you get a power index that's about half. If I looked at a food product, I mean, we're talking terrible. You're going to be talking in the 40s and 50s on both ones. Just the rate of failure in food is just much more pronounced than it is in HBC. But we have the ability then, and we always say, I want my analysis to be at the speed of thought. Did those assortment decisions, if I looked at the mid-range, would the assortment decisions have been any better there? And it really actually was a little bit worse. How about salon, where I already identified that I had that problem in performance, and at least I can say that I improved or I had a little bit better relative performance for the new versus existing than I had in mid-range. So I can bounce back and forth between that growth and productivity, and I also have then the ability to go in the rankings, what are the best new items, etc. And we can always, do that at another time, and that's kind of part of the follow-ups that, as an attendee, that be more than happy to take you through how you would get to those. Let me also then take you through, because one of the key things is I just gave you an overview of how that fared for the category overall, but we can also then flip to another one of our analyses that talks about innovation. It does vary by brand. And so one of the things we see, in particular, the number one brand here, it's Pikachu. So, obviously we're doing the Pokemon masking, but and this is all mask data. The data is actual, but we're masking it all just to not reveal any confidentiality issues. But so here we're looking at the gray area. You can see on an existing basis the Skew Count really didn't change that much, up a little bit. The new versus existing, blue versus orange, you can see I added a lot more new items, or this company added a lot more new than were discontinued. So there's a net gain in Skew Count. But on a base velocity basis, actually the overall sales went down a bit. So despite all those additional items, the sales were actually less. And you can see that over here in the data. So the existing items, again, pretty steady, up 1%, 3% gain in Skew Count. But if I look at the discontinued versus new, I hurt my business by 24% from that section of my business. Despite a 42% gain in Skew Count, my velocity for those items plunged 47%. And look at how my base velocity at 12%, or 12,000 units per SKU, compares to what was in there. So that's highly predictive that those items are going to get wiped out in the planogram coming up pretty soon. So this gives you an early warning system that that's almost irredeemable. If the gap was a little bit better, then you may say, hey, I can come in and do some things to save it, but just kiss that goodbye. Get the return authorizations ready, and bring it on back the truck out, because there's a lot of that stuff getting discontinued. So that's innovation. So now we'll switch to consumer-based data, and this is either from three prominent sources here: Nielsen, IRI, or InfoScout are the three. What we're not talking about is shopper data from retailers, and the big flaw in all that is you don't have visibility to the rest of the world. But back to that analogy or metaphor I used at the beginning on cryogenically frozen. Here's a cryogenically frozen analysis here. I pulled this off the web, Progressive Grocer, but I asked some of the consultants to send some stuff that they've kind of seen through the industry throughout the year, and they were throwing stuff back from 2000, 1999. It hasn't changed a bit. What we're looking at here is this is a particular category or a brand at a specific retailer, so I have to shop the retailer and buy the category. Certain of those retailers buy the category at retailer A, and that's that 56% of conversion. 44% don't buy there, and so that's what didn't get converted, the non-conversion. And then we track, okay, of that gets converted, 43% stays within the retailer, but 57% went to other retailers, and here's how it kind of allocated. So to this type of analysis, I would just say pedestrian, Philistine, blatherskite, troglodyte. It's just a complete, absolutely non-progression of the entire science or lack thereof of analyzing this data. There really is several things lacking about this, and let's just kind of go through what the problems are with that approach. First of all, it's often incomplete. So if we go back, epithets aside, actually it's not me that says that. I've only heard that there are some people that will call those that do this analysis pedestrians and Philistines, etc., just some people. But if one of the issues here is not complete. So you see this 44%, we didn't really track where their purchases went, and arguably that is in many instances more important. So sometimes I see it tracked, other times not. But so there's this inordinate focus on the leakage portion. The other big problem is no relative comparison. So what would you expect to lose to a given retailer? I mean, for a non-food product, of course you're going to leak most of your revenue and volume to Walmart. They're the biggest retailer out there. And if not Walmart, it's going to be Costco or Target, all the big retailers. The question is, what did you actually leak and what did you expect to leak based on fair share? And then how does that compare to similar products and to your key competitors? And then most importantly, there's no indicated actions from the analysis. Okay, so you're telling me I'm leaking a disproportionate amount of my volume to, a certain retailer. So what? What do I do about it? And so what I'm going to show you now is a way to kind of do something about it and then introduce along the way a concept called slippage. It's not a new concept, it's a new verbiage. And it's a new way to focus your business on conversion analysis overall. So let's go through this. So we're first of all talking about brand conversion and share of wallet. The orange is what the conversion rate is. Share of wallet is once they get converted into my retailer, how much do they spend? So this is a particular brand, Carmander. That 23% of those that bought the brand were converted in this particular retailer, being Mars, and then once they were converted, they spent 56% in my store. It's interesting to note that all these blue numbers are higher than 50%. You will almost always get that in non-food products. Just the simple truth is people aren't buying this all that much. There's a lot of people that just buy it once and twice a year. So by definition, your one-time buyers are spending 100% in your store. So that's kind of also renders the whole concept of loyalty marketing somewhat moot for a lot of these, particularly drug chains. But so the numbers here are the conversion, 23% conversion. 77 were not converted. That's the non-converted number, and that's the slippage, and that 77, much higher than 23, much more important to understand what's going on with those people. The share of wallet is that number 2, so that is how much they spent in there. The other portion leaked to other outlets. If we go down here now, here's that relative comparison. That is, what do I expect to lose to Earth, the retailer Earth, based on a fair share, and we call it fair share X, meaning fair share excluding the revenue, the share that Mars commands in the market. So here it's 37% Earth does if I back out all the Mars volume. But if we look at number 4, we actually leaked an above average amount, 43% went to Earth. And even more importantly, 52% of the slippage went to Earth. So that's an important comparison. What's the bigger issue? Is it slippage or is it leakage? You can see that every other geography we look at, or only 2 of the other geographies, am I above average. Jupiter, that's pretty high numbers, and then Neptune, arguably too small to worry about. So what do we take away from this? Well, first of all, we're going to focus on the relative threats, not the absolute. So I don't care so much that this number is high. I just care that it's much higher than it should be based on fair share. Also, slippage problems. If I have slippage problems, more often than not, in fact, the vast majority of issues relate to distribution. A key product isn't carried at that particular retailer, or everyday pricing. I'm just out of whack. My pricing isn't competitive. If there's leakage problems, those tend to be cherry pickers, either a result of promotion, where we know from our own research about half consumers say they will go switch their retail preferences based on promotional availability, and then also innovation. There's kind of a new product that I found interesting. I was in the store and I tried it. So those things that can generate trial. The key thing is to focus your efforts on what matters. So with this analysis, I can focus on this one, 2, and then this 23% here. And let's see how we would do that. So we're going back to total insights here. We're going to go to our leakage, conversion versus and leakage. I'm going to go back to Carmander, and what this will tell me now is I've harmonized both my panel, data here to the left with my scan data. So I immediately get access to where are my distribution gaps, because remember, if it's a slippage issue, the vast majority of those problems relate to distribution, and you can see right away the top 2 items at Earth not stocked at Mars, and then you can see some other distribution voids. And as you kind of go deep in the assortment, you see just in pure raw Skew Count, Earth carrying a lot more than Mars. The pricing seems to be competitive, so I've eliminated that as an issue, and I can focus just on making sure I plug those important distribution gaps. Recall that Jupiter was a leakage issue, and that was more related to promotion. So let's take a look here where I've decomposed. I can decompose my innovation. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of relative innovation in Jupiter right now, but I can focus on this measure right here, my incremental lift per event. Mars, it's less than an incremental week every time I promote, whereas in Jupiter it's much higher, and a likely reason for that is it's hitting lower price points. It's being available and achievable to a greater audience of consumers that can afford it, $2 versus $2.78. So that's where I just automatically then tie in the so what by having all my data together, having it all harmonized, and understanding what are the implications coming out of shortcomings in leakage versus slippage. So what does all this mean? So let's kind of summarize on what are the key takeaways. Well, first of all, I talked about power index. So it's a more efficient measure of sales productivity. It balances the dollar and unit performance, and it highlights all the areas where I have extreme underperformance or overperformance, which you particularly see in super premium as well as value segments. I also talked about innovation, where we can use machine learning to identify discontinued items as well as the status of each of the items. It could also then, we could take it one step further and even do in and out items. It greatly expands that innovation and assortment analysis if I have better status coding, and we're isolating on the quantity and quality of all the issues related to distribution and new distribution and all my decisions. And then finally we talked leakage and slippage. So I want to understand the difference between slippage, which is the non-converted buyers, and leakage. And this, I should have caveated this in the bullet. Slippage is usually more important for non-food. Leakage and slippage are roughly of equal importance when I'm looking at a food product, only because the repurchase rates are much higher. I'm providing a measure of relative importance on volume loss, so that's that fair share X measure, and always recall there's different strategic implications for high leakage versus slippage. If I have a leakage issue, it's promotion or innovation. Slippage, distribution or everyday pricing. So in summary, just don't be a Philistine. Start differentiating yourself with all of these new ways to look at the data. You have it in your power right now, and it says a lot that you've taken the time out of your day to listen to this presentation, to expose yourself to these new ways to conduct your business, and this will truly differentiate you versus all the other companies that are hacking about the data with the exact same way that they've been doing for the last 25 years. So thanks again for listening, and for now I'm going to toss it back to Dustin. Dustin.
Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate it. We're going to move on to the questions now. I have a couple of questions so far, not many. If you see the control panel over on the right-hand side, you should see a question box. You just key in a question there, and that'll pop up for me, and I'll read those off. The first question comes from the beginning of the presentation around the productivity discussion. It's one we get a lot. Why not use average item selling, which is the points of distribution divided by ACV of the total segment? Dividing by 100, it's like assuming every item is in 100% distribution. It overstates the true number of SKUs.
Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but the main reason is because you overstate, because I'm looking at my market share across the entire chain. I also want to look at my distribution across the entire chain. So think of that measure as somewhat similar to GRPs in a marketing context. that makes no assumptions about the reach or the frequency. It's just telling me total impressions, and that's a similar concept for distribution. I can show you numerous instances, and I've seen a lot of companies and other manufacturers really screw up because, let's say